So, okay. Well, Kevin, we are so eager to listen to your presentation here on the Georgian supra and its traditions. It's so vital for any student of the Caucasus and Georgia in particular. So please.
Okay, so let me begin by first of all putting on my PowerPoint. I think I've got this. So just to confirm with all of you, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Good. So what I'm going to do is go over one of the perhaps most flamboyant Georgian traditions, certainly one that foreigners encounter, and sometimes in far more quantity than they ever expected during their first visits to Georgia. And sometimes they find it almost an imposition rather than a pleasant ritual, the Georgian banquet or supra. And so what I'm going to do is I've planned actually to cover a number of topics related to the supra. Some of you may find this redundant. Those of you who've already been to banquets can probably take their academic Viertelstunde during the first about 15 minutes or so, because it'll all be stuff you already know. For those of you who haven't been to a supra before, and there may be some in the group, this might be a good chance to get prepared for what awaits you when you finally arrive in Georgia, whenever that happens. So the topics I'll go over, I may not get to the ones at the very bottom, like the ones about the parodies and the supra and social models. It depends on how much time we take with the first subjects, but I really do want to go over the basic rules and ingredients of the Georgian supra, and also talk a bit about where the supra came from, the sort of all this debate, actually rather fascinating, about its origins. And also the concept of agonism, which is in the title of my talk. That'll come perhaps after going through this introductory material. And so the term supra is in fact not a Georgian word, at least not in an etymological sense. It comes from Persian, and a Persian word sofreh. And this has, in a sense, the same polysemy for the linguists in the group, as does the Georgian word based on it. That is, it refers to both a physical object, a tablecloth, that is a sign that you've transformed a table into a banqueting space, is by putting a cloth on top of it, right? Setting the table. And also the banquet that takes place, that's with the food that's on top of the cloth, is also called a supra. And this we find this also in Persian. The term refers to both the tablecloth and also a type of ritual feast. We'll see a picture of it later on that has a kind of ritual or votive meaning. And what's important to note about the supra is the fact that it involves the consummation of alcoholic beverages, but it's not a free-for-all, or even a kind of European-style dinner party where you might have a toast to begin. Somebody will hold up a glass, and the French will always say something kind of banal like chin chin. And then they'll start maybe drinking. Initially, everyone drinks at the same time after kind of greeting each other this way. But then after that, pretty much everyone drinks what's in their hand at their own pace. Some drink more, some drink less, some get refills, some don't. The Georgian supra is not at all like that. And one of the first things that foreigners have to learn is that it's not only when you must drink, but also when you must not drink. So I'll start with just some pictures of supras, just to kind of take you through my own personal journey as a supralologist, going back to one of the very first time I was in Georgia in 1985-86 for a 9-month doctoral fellowship. And here's a typical late Soviet Georgian birthday banquet. And you see some things that if you know a supra, you'll identify right away. First of all, there's all that food and wine and the bottles on the table, with each person holding, having sometimes not one, but 2 or 3 plates in front of them. Then there's also the fact that there's entertainment going on. People sing, sometimes dance at supras. You may have also noticed that the men are all crowded around each other at the end of the table. In some more traditional supras, in fact, there are only men at the table and women are not there at all. or they're at a separate table, or they're kind of coming back and forth and serving the men at the table. In this group, there are women present, but you can see they're sort of on this a bit on the periphery, at least for events like singing. That tends to be the guys that do that. And so it's quite a multimedia event, and involving not just the consummation of drinks and food, but also a lot of song and dance, and then of course the toasting, which is of course one of the central features of a Georgian supra. The most common type of supra is the kind of informal supra with friends, like in this example. This is the couple in the center, Berucha and Nona, are two of my oldest friends in Georgia. I've known them since Soviet times. And this is at their summer house in Ananuri, and with a couple of their neighbors also at the table. And this is just kind of a get together, but notice nonetheless all the food on the table, all the wine on the table, and also to the fact that the food is kind of laid out on little tiny plates like this. The idea is that that people kind of serve themselves. In fact, what's interesting is the contrast. Often at a European style banquet, people are served their food at the directions of the host, who bring in a plate, and somebody's going to put the food on the plate for the guests. But they can drink as much or as little as they want. They drink more or less at their own pace, but they eat according to the rhythm of the table. At the Georgian supra, it's the reverse. You drink at a rhythm that's set by the toastmaster, and we'll get to that in a second, but you can eat as much or as little as you want. The food is there in front of you on little plates. You've got your bread, you've got your cheese, you've got different sorts of dips and sauces. You may have kind of a polenta called the romi at some types of festivals, especially in the West. Meat, fruit, all kinds of things. And there you see them all there. But it's pretty much up to you to take as much or as little as you want. Obviously, if you're a foreigner, you'll get a lot of encouragement to eat, 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 and eat. But you don't have to. And that's really up to you. Whereas the drinking is quite different. That becomes almost compulsory in certain, at certain points in the supra. Also, to field work in the Caucasus, in Georgia in particular, often involves participating in supras, because after all, you're being hosted by the people you're visiting in the field. And in fact, in this case, we actually have two field teams that just by chance came together in the same house in Upper Achara, which is a majority Muslim province of Georgia in the southwest. And it was in a house of with about 3-story house of one of the principal families of the village, Chanchalo, with the men all on the upper floor at a banquet and the women at a lower floor. And I was there, and also too, you can see at the end of the table, a group of musicologists who are recording, who are mostly downstairs with the women recording their songs. They're the singers in the group Mzetamze, for people who know Georgian folk music. And so but they came up at one point because they wanted to hear the men sing and dance. And so they were having to join us at this point. So basically you have like 2 teams of researchers there with a banquet going on. And so part of becoming part of the training of an ethnographer in Georgia is also learning how to deal with supras. So it's, and I always find that it's one of the real challenges for my students when they do field work over there, is learning how to manage their participation in these things and be able to keep a clear head, because supras generate a lot of really fascinating talk and activity that you really do want to observe, and if hopefully without getting so drunk that you are no longer able to keep track of what's going on. And then you also have the phenomenon of what I call open air supras. That is, and these are really kind of fascinating. They're totally unplanned, impromptu events that just happen when people are traveling on the road, and cross another group of men. It's again a kind of a guy thing. And sometimes, and what's interesting is that Georgians seem to prepare for this. So, for example, I was in a car with my friend Berucha, who you already saw, and there he is again. We are heading across from the South Caucasus over the pass just before Shatili into the North Caucasus, into the northern part of Georgia. And as we were crossing the pass, we came across a group of chasseurs and also a couple of people traveling by foot who were moving from one village to another. And we all just happened to get to the spot about the same time. And immediately, we all got out of the car. They all got out of their car. The people on foot stopped. Everyone, amazingly enough, produced a bottle of some kind of vodka, Shipitauri, sort of local vodka that very popular in places like that. And without further ado, we had a banquet. And so, as you can see, there's the bottle. There's what bits of food people had. Everybody had more or less emptied the stuff they had in their pockets or in their car and put it out there. So we had sausages, some bread, and maybe some cheese. I can't remember if we had cheese. And then everybody gathered around and had a few toasts to our meeting, to our good travels, to whatever we were heading toward. And this kind of, and also too, I noticed that that Berucha had already prepared for this because he had his own bottle of alcohol in the car, plus he had a couple of horns, small ones. So we were all set with all the utensils we needed for a supra. And so in fact, this is kind of interesting that often chance encounters, if they involve men at least, often lead to a supra. And so, and this happens a lot more often than you might realize, there's also kind of the Soviet notion of supra, that it was kind of part of Soviet culture, Soviet Georgian culture, especially, and often associated with Stalin, who was kind of, I think Paul Manning refers to him as the Über tamada, the ultimate dictator of the dining table. And so here's an example of perhaps a very stylized and elaborate Soviet-style banquet from a film called A Night with Stalin, or Belshazzar's Feast, based on a story by the Abkhaz writer Fazil Iskander. And so there you see kind of in a kind of a parody of the last banquet of Leonardo da Vinci, a long table with Stalin and his disciples, mainly Beria, Lakoba, and Voroshilov, and a couple of other figures from Soviet times gathered around him. And also too, you see lots of supras in Georgian film. They are often a kind of component of scenes set in villages or somebody's in town where you have men gathering together. Here's one example from Khiaruli Romani. And even in cartoons, this is a cartoon based on a story by Vajab Shavala called the Blue Jays Wedding Feast, or Chikta Kortsili. And there you've got a scene of I'm sorry for the reproduction, but there you see is kind of a character, I think it's an eagle, who is the tamada, holding up a horn, and then you see various birds seated around, geese, ducks, and various smaller fowl, all gathered around a banqueting table and having a banquet to commemorate a wedding in this case. And just to show you how important the supra is in the Georgian conception of their own culture, and also how that culture is seen outside of Georgia, the supra has actually been elevated to the intangible heritage list of UNESCO as of 2017. And so as a result, it joins such things as Georgian polyphonic singing, and as kind of one of these as part of Georgian cultural heritage, and therefore something that is celebrated in kind of representations of Georgia abroad. Okay, so let's go into kind of what makes a supra a supra. So it's kind of the ingredients you need so that you can make a supra if you want to on your own. And in fact, it's quite possible to do that even without Georgians present. So the first ingredient is you need alcohol, and not just any alcohol. Ideally, it's done with wine. Wine is what you drink at supras, but not necessarily, depending on circumstances and the preferences of people at the table as well. You can have vodka, that is some kind of strong spirits, as your supra drink. The ideal case would be a chacha, or it's like Italian grappa. It's a strong vodka made with the residue from grape processing into wine, and can be quite strong. But I've also been at supras where other types of strong drink have been used, like, for example, taplis arachi or santlis arachi. This is a type of vodka made from honey, and rather the wax that honey is made in beehives, and it's absolutely delicious. And sometimes as well, if nothing else available, you can even take out a Russian bottle of stolichnaya or whatever you prefer and use that, and it's perfectly legitimate as a supra drink. On the other hand, and this is always something that you have to be warned about, not beer. Beer does not count. Beer is not considered a supra beverage unless you have it there as a soft drink, in which case it's in the same category as Sprite and Coca-Cola. That is something you can drink in between toasts, but you can't make a toast with it. The one exception is in the very special circumstances of the northeast Georgian highland provinces, Pshavi, Khevsureti, and Tusheti, where beer, but only beer that's been brewed under the supervision of the ritual specialist, the chevispiri, I'll talk about this a bit later, is in fact served to people at the sanctuary on the feast day, and therefore everyone drinks it. But that's the only kind of beer that has that kind of the same, might say, ritual function as does wine or chacha. Otherwise, as the old joke goes, beer is what you use when you toast Khrushchev or someone like that, right? It's considered almost an insult to raise a glass of beer and make a toast. Second ingredient is that you also have to have somebody who's kind of the master of ceremonies. The Georgian word for this is tamada, or olumbashi is another term used mostly in villages now. And so this is the person who is responsible for the sequence of toasts, who kind of signs themes and sometimes even picks people to drink after him. And there's even a kind of pre-supra ritual for selecting a tamada if one isn't already been designated. Often it's the person who convokes, often if the supra is being hosted and has been planned in beforehand, the host will either be the tamada, or more often will actually designate someone else, a family friend who's regarded as particularly good in toast management, to be the tamada. And then the guests will then salute the choice by drinking a first toast to the tamada before the feast officially begins. Other times the guests kind of choose among themselves, and there'll be a bit of discussion as to who wants to be tamada. Oh no, not me. Maybe Rezo. Rezo much better than me. Then Rezo says, oh no, not me. I'm sure Berucha Upata would do a better job, but it kind of goes around everybody saying no, not me, until finally there's a consensus that kind of emerges, and somebody's more or less made to appear as though being forced to assume the role. And then there's also the fact that once the tamada has been selected and the drinks are there, you still have to follow certain rules about how the toasts proceed. And concerning the rules concerning the consumption of the alcohol, the idea of how much of how much you drink each time. And usually, it's the idea is that you want to at least give the impression that you're drinking everything in your glass on each toast. Though there are ways you can kind of reduce the consumption as the feast goes on in various ways, but you have to be very clever about doing this so it doesn't attract too much attention. Also, the roles of individuals at the table and the types of toasts as well, which will also determine the sequence of drinking. And then there's also this kind of competitive spirit, which is really kind of fascinating, which is often not discussed when people talk about the supra, which I call agonism, drawing upon a term from Hellenic Greek tradition. And so we'll talk about that a bit later as well. And so the terms for toastmaster, interesting enough, neither tamada nor olumbashi is a Georgian word. Tamada comes from Circassian and kind of refers to someone who's kind of a chief of some kind of ritual, and not necessarily a banquet. And dolumbashi means sort of the head of the drinking. Dolum in Turkish refers to kind of the big sack that wine used to be transported in, and sort of the person who's responsible for distributing the wine that's in that sack. But there's a whole kind of people have notions about what makes a good tamada. And so people would talk about why, say, someone like Gote Cholokashvili, who unfortunately is no longer alive, and who is regarded as one of the great tamadas in Tbilisi, and why what he has that, say, other people might not have, that makes him such a good choice as tamada. And so Florian Mühlfried, who some of you may know, an anthropologist who worked with me for several years in Jena and is now teaching at Ilia University in Tbilisi, put together in his doctoral thesis a kind of semantic study of what makes a good tamada. And he did kind of interviews with people and looked for keywords that often came up. And so among them are this idea of eloquence. A tamada speaks well, speaks in proper Georgian with eloquence, a really excellent, he has excellent rhetorical skills. He's also somebody who has humor. He can tell jokes and make people laugh when it's time to do that. He has a sort of personal dignity that also confers dignity on the banquet itself. So it remains something, not just a drinking bash, but really something that has a kind of a ceremonial content to it, a feeling to it that is somehow something on a special occasion. He's also somebody said to have possessed the virtue of manliness, Vaishkatsova. But interesting enough, that doesn't necessarily exclude women, as we'll see in a moment. It's regarded as masculinity, but in sort of almost an abstract sense, not necessarily indicating, having a paired XY chromosomes. And also to a knowledge of Georgian culture, knowledge of Georgian tradition, and finally, and not the least, somebody who drinks well, who can really consume as much and sometimes more as the other people at the table without really undergoing the effects. So all of these kind of features kind of cluster around the idea of an ideal tamada. And but yes, as I said, women can be tamadas, and here are a couple examples that I've encountered. Sometimes it's in the case of sort of in Tbilisi and kind of urban settings among younger people, especially part of the cultural elite. Perfectly fine to have a woman preside, especially if there are more women than men there, and everybody's cool with having a woman as tamada. So here's my friend Zia Chikhradze playing the role of tamada at a gathering several years ago. And even back in Soviet times, we had some occasions, Rizzo, you might remember this one, in any case, we've got the photo to prove it, that a foreign guest, my friend Priscilla, was selected as tamada at a banquet for my birthday, actually in 1986. And she did a wonderful job, as I recall. And so there she is at the table. So that sometimes, yes, by special request, you can have again, some traditionalists might grumble about it, and but it is possible. And then also too, leaving aside kind of, I might say, modern settings and settings associated with, especially with urban centers, there is a traditional, even in villages, you can get women as tamadas at all women supras, and in those contexts where the women are in their own space with no men around. This is especially common in Svanity. Svan religion, Svan's folk religion, is an absolutely fascinating subject that I've consecrated about 20 plus years to studying. And there's still so much to learn about it. But there are, every Svan village in Upper Svanity, at least, has certain spaces, ritual areas, where only women are allowed. Men are not permitted. So for example, in the village Latali, where I've done most of my field work, there are several sites more or less on the edge of the village that the women know about, and where they'll gather 1 or 2 times a year and have their own banquet. First of all, they'll present offerings in front of the sacred site itself. In this case, it's an old tree that's called Samtaishi Lamaria. Though Lamaria means the Virgin Mary, and Samtaishi or Samtai is the name of the place where this ceremony occurs. And then after presenting their offerings of, the only thing about women's banquets, by the way, that distinguishes them from men's ritual banquets is that there's no meat present, because that meat involves slaughtering of animals, and the women don't do that. So these are vegetarian events. In any case, they're all you can see at the table. They have bread, cheese, various kinds of fruits and vegetables, and lots to drink. And so this lady here, I'm not sure if you can see her. I'll try and point to her with a little arrow. The older woman here with holding the glass. She's the tamada at this event. I'm describing this because for the reasons I just described, I wasn't there when this happened. It wasn't allowed. But my colleague, Zerediani, went with the camera and took pictures, and she told me that this lady was the tamada. And so as a result, she played the same role as a man would, and the women are, by this point, they've already had quite a bit to drink and are kind of off on their own. Some are paying attention to her, and some seem not to be at all. And at the end, they got rather slap-happy drunk, I would say, and had a very good time. So yes, women can be tamadas. There's just have to choose the right place and time to do so. So now to the norms about the toasting itself. The first one concerns the sequence. In what sequence do you go? That is, so sometimes it seems fairly loose, and sometimes you get the impression that the tamada kind of makes it up as he goes along. But in fact, there often is a kind of structure to the toast sequence. And in some parts of Georgia, it's quite rigid. So for example, in, I think it's in Guria, you begin with a toast to peace. That's often the first or second toast. In the highlands of northeastern Georgia, you often begin with a toast, a commemoration of the dead. That's often one of the very first toasts to the ancestors that went before. And sometimes there's actually a three toasts. The ancestors, those who were at the supra, the ancestors of everyone that everyone knows from the village, from Georgia. And then the third is for ancestors that have no one to remember them. And so they get as well a toast in their honor, even though they have no living survivors who remember their names. The order of drinkers is also something that can be regulated depending on the place and the tradition. So in some cases, after the tamada, who is always the first on each round, gives his toast, people self-select. So somebody would just say, okay, I want to follow up on that. Sometimes the tamada can designate, alla verdi varshentan, I pick you to follow me. And in some cases, it really is kind of up, fairly free. Whereas, like say in Svaneti, it's quite strict. That is, you go always in an anti-clockwise direction. So if I'm seated at the table and I'm the tamada, then the next person to talk will be seated at my right. Then the person at his right goes next, and then so on around the table. And then finally, the person seated at my left is the last one to talk. And that poor person will always be the last one on each round until the end of the supra, just because he ended up choosing the seat next to my left side. And that's that. Geography is destiny at a supra, at least in Svaneti. Then there's a question of quantity. Ideally, you empty whatever it is you're drinking from. But in some cases, people find ways to, if they drink full glasses for the first 5, 6, 7 toasts, and everybody else does likewise, the next one, they might drink 7/8 of a glass. Then at the one after that's maybe 3/4 of a glass. And maybe if with a bit of luck, and if the supra goes on for lots and lots of time, they may get down to the point where they're really only drinking half a glass, or maybe even a bit less if everybody else is kind of feeling they've had a lot as well. You sort of have to kind of judge both how noticeable your drinking amount is and whether everybody else is doing about the same. It kind of takes a lot of calculus to work out how to do this. But so there is a principle of everybody drinking to the bolomde, to the end on every toast. And the reality, that's not always the case, okay? And then there's also one thing about toasting as well, and this is why I showed this particular picture of this gentleman in the middle here, whose name is Ilo Proveli. He was a very famous, well-known figure in the Georgian province of Pshavi, up to the north of Tbilisi. And he's also known for being a figure to whom Anak Alandadze, the great Georgian poet, dedicated quite a few poems. She had met him while doing fieldwork up there, and they two became very close friends. And so he is also regarded as a real depository of traditional knowledge. And on this occasion, where I met him in the company of the ethnographer Miriam Hutsishvili, Ilo told us as we began banquet at his house, and we kind of picked up our glasses and kind of touched them to the glass of another person, he said, "Don't do that." And I looked at him, "Why? What's wrong?" And he says, "Georgians don't do that. Vaja Pshavila taught us a long time ago, and it's a tradition, at least among the Pshavs, that that's a European, a Russian tradition, and Georgians don't do that with their glasses. That you hold up your glass toward someone, but you don't touch the glass to the other person's glass the way Europeans do." And so it took us a while. Actually, I had to, several times I was about to do that, and I had to say, oh, Ilo told me not to. But it's so it seems that there are some interesting theories about what the proper behavior is with regard to how you actually begin your toast with the drinking glass held up. And it seems apparently touching glasses is not permitted, at least in the highland areas. There are also special banquet toasting types, like an alla verde is a toast where the person who speaks chooses the person who will follow up. So I'll choose a team. If I'm tamada, and I'll say Rezo really knows a lot about this. And I'll say Rezo Shentan var alla verde, and so he'll talk after me. Then he'll elaborate on what I said, and then Rezo will choose someone else, and that person will follow up, and it goes around so that everybody gets a chance, but they're doing it now according to the choice of the previous drinker. A vachtanguri is a two-person toast where you kind of wrap your arms around, a bit like the Bruderschaft that Europeans might know, when they go past from using vous to using tu as their address pronoun from plural to singular. And ideally you drink together with your arms. It's very difficult for one person to demonstrate this, but your arms are wrapped around. And then there is also special toast for commemorating the dead, at which people stand. It's always done standing. And also you'll pour out sometimes a little bit of wine onto either a piece of bread or onto the floor as a libation. So you're sharing your drink with the dead souls. Okay, I hope everybody's following this. It's a lot of information. I'm trying to kind of compact it into the time that been allotted for this presentation. Anyway, keep notes on things, and if you have questions, believe me, I'll try to address them all when we get to that time. So what does a toast look like, and how are they, and what is a typical sequence? So we actually have an interesting document. This was put together by the American linguist Diane Holliski, who was in Georgia in the late 70s. And even though she wasn't really looking at the supra as such, she attended enough of them, being, after all, one of the few foreigners in Georgia at the time. She was obviously a prized guest, and so she had plenty of chances to observe them, and began taking notes. And sometime around 1990-91, she published a kind of a brief article, a kind of a how-to guide on how to take part in the Georgian supra. And so what she did is she, first of all, gives an idea of what a typical sequence of toast topics would be at an urban banquet for, say, a birthday. So, for example, you have the initial toast to the tamada, but that's actually a toast that's kind of out of the sequence, because that's the one that begins, that precedes the supra as such. That's where the tamada has been chosen or has been named. People acknowledge the tamada with an initial toast, but I would actually, instead of numbering that number 1, I would number it 0, because it's really not the supra proper. The real supra begins with the toast to the birthday person. It is the occasion for which people got together. And then it goes through that person's relatives and friends and so forth to toast to those who've died and no longer are there. To the two guests, sometimes more themes to general topics, like, say, to women, if it's mostly men at the table, and so on and so forth. And then usually it ends with a final toast to what she calls a toast to the roof or ceiling, amchers. That sounds very strange as a toast. Like, why would you toast that sounds like just part of the structure of the house, why you're toasting the ceiling of all things. In fact, it's really a toast not to the ceiling as such, but rather to the guardian spirit or angel that presides over that house. And in Soviet times, perhaps to avoid overt reference to Christian concepts, they often substituted the term ceiling for that. But it really refers to, and you often hear this nowadays, Hovlad Sminda, the all holy, that is Virgin Mary, who is seen as kind of the guardian patron of all of Georgia. And so it's really a kind of a ritual toast to the patron of the family and by extension of the entire country. And after that, usually when that toast is given, then the supra is officially over and people are kind of go home or to stagger home, depending on how much they had. She also made her own estimate of how much people drank, and she was estimating that with Soviet-style drinking glasses, which hold roughly 150 to 200 grams of alcohol each, and consumption numbering well beyond between 15 and 20 glasses in the course of an evening, that a person could easily do between 2 and 3 liters of wine in the course of the evening. And that's, I would almost say, could be considered a minimum for a regulation Georgian banquet. Sometimes you go well beyond that amount, and believe me, I know. Paul Manning kind of tried to chart out this toast sequence according to his concept of fade out. That is kind of the idea of a transition from more physically present and specific individuals towards something that's more generic or more abstract. So like you begin with toasting to the, or what he calls the origo, that is a person in whose honor one is having the banquet, toward that person's family members, friends, grandparents, relatives, and so on, going further and further away from that person. Then finally we get to abstract categories. Well, women's not necessarily an abstract category. The women are actually physically present, but somehow being regarded in this case as sort of in the abstract. Then children, abstract ancestors, Georgians, and all good people, and so forth. And then often in the second part of the feast, after you've gotten through what seem to be kind of more or less obligatory toasts, you can also get lots of personal toasts, as the tamada makes sure that everyone at the table has a toast drunk to his or her name by the others. And this can often go on for a long, long, long time and involve lots and lots and lots of alcohol. And usually by that time, as Manning notes, people are getting increasingly tipsy. So there's a kind of a fade out, not only in the sense of the direction of the toast from real to abstract, but also from sober to increasingly under the influence of alcohol. And so it's also sometimes a quite literal fade out. And so that by the end, yes, you've probably done well, certainly, more than a dozen and sometimes more than 2 dozen toasts in the course of an evening, which will sometimes stretch on for 6 or 7 hours, depending on how many people are there and what the occasion is. And I'll just show you, this is from Deanne's article, a typical toast that she recorded in transliterated Georgian and also the text in English translation. And it has kind of a flowery, kind of almost over the top kind of sound to it, especially when you translate it. And one thing I've discovered in my own experience when I've tried to transport the supra tradition to non-Georgian context, that is with students, let's say, where we're speaking English or French, and I try to get them to do their own toasts in their own language, is that they sound funny. A toast that sounds absolutely wonderful in Georgian sounds really kind of insincere and over the top if you do it in English. We are happy that we have in you such a sincere, hopeful friend who always lends a hand in time of trouble. Such generosity also sounds like, oh God, stop it, for God's sakes. I mean, it does sound like a bit too much. Whereas in Georgian, it's absolutely lovely, and it really is really very effective. So it's kind of a funny, it's kind of, there's something about it that's kind of, I would say, specific to the Georgian language that I can't really quite get my finger on, but at least my experience is that somehow supras don't do well in translation. Unless, of course, the foreigners are in Georgia, in which case they'll have somebody interpreting for them, and sometimes that person could add in all the necessary stuff to make it sound like a Georgian toast, regardless of what it was originally pronounced as. But to finish with the toasting, I want to also point out that when we talk about what makes an ideal toast in a Georgian context, what is it that makes a toast work, right? What comes to mind, to me at least, is that it's what people in rhetorical studies would call an epidemic genre. Okay, so an ideal toast has certain kind of, you might say, linguistic markers. There's certain phrases that are used often in toasts that if you know Georgian, you'll recognize them almost instantly. This is somebody's toasting. Could hear this, a phrase like "cheers or something like that. And also, there's even a grammatical form, the pluperfect subjunctive, which is rather rare in spoken Georgian. But in a banquet, people often use forms like getsotslos, gebednieros, kargad kopelichavi. I mean, that you just don't hear that in ordinary everyday Georgian, but in a banquet, yes, these forms kind of come out and are used. And So what I meant by an epidictic rhetoric, this is a category that goes back to Aristotle, and he describes rhetoric that's intended to persuade, the sort of what we usually think rhetoric is supposed to do, that is to argue a point and convince the other person. But he also said often rhetoric doesn't have that function at all. People are already quite persuaded that, say, when I stand up to praise a great person, everybody agrees that he's great, but I'm still going to praise him anyway, and everybody else is going to applaud because I did such a wonderful job of talking about him and all the wonderful things he did. And also too, so it's very much a ceremonial type of rhetoric that that is evaluated not for its persuasiveness. That is, did I really convince these people that this person, whatever they may think about, is really fantastic, but rather the fact that it's the eloquence and, I might say, the aesthetic component of my own presentation that actually counts, not so much the virtues of the person I'm talking about. And so, and in a sense, this applies to all of the supra. What makes supras work is that everybody kind of shares in the basic ground rules. That is, they know how to do a supra, or they learn very quickly. But also, too, they're kind of sharing in as well the kind of idea of appreciating good supra performance, a really eloquent and wonderful tamada. Some guest who quite unexpectedly gets up and, instead of making a toast, recites a poem that he just wrote. I've actually seen this happen quite often. Somebody was toasting to mothers, and a guest gets up and said, my mother died a week ago, and I wrote a poem after she died. And he gets up and recites the poem from memory, as Georgians usually recite poetry. And everybody at the table melts, literally. I never saw so many huge 6'4" men, big as bears, shedding tears at the table as that on that occasion, because it was something that kind of really touched them. The fact that it was expressed not just by a discussion about talking about his mother, but also the fact that he wrote a poem about her. And it's this kind of thing, this aesthetic component, that's really, really important. And it's also one of the things that takes a lot of practice and experience to really appreciate. That sort of getting, first of all, obviously you have to have high familiarity with the language, but also with kind of a lot of background, a lot of things having to do with Georgian culture, Georgian literature, which is often invoked, people reciting poems that other people wrote. Sometimes references to all kinds of things in the history of the country and so forth that all come out, that all are the sign of what makes a successful tamada, but also a successful supra participant successful. Some comments on where the supra came from. There was quite an active debate about 20 some years ago about whether the supra is really as ancient as some people make it out to be. And so some historians and sociologists, Georgian sociologists, were making the claim that, well, no, if you actually look at the textual evidence and the documentation, references to supras as such, and especially the references to tamadas, and also to the kind of tamada type toasting, that is the long sequence of thematic toasts, don't seem to go back any further than the mid-19th century. And there's even a famous reference to banqueting by the poet Akaki Tsereteli. We even says supras like we have now in Tbilisi. I don't remember anything like this in my village. We never had banquets like that. We had only a few toasts. They were always usually began with prayers, invocations of God and the saints, and very few toasts to general themes. We'd have personal toasts, but not much beyond that. And they didn't really, it tended not to have that kind of formal structure, and the tamada's role was fairly limited. On the other hand, there are also some references, there's a kind of another debate about to what extent the Georgian supra, as we know it now, is based on models imported from Russia, say the kind of gatherings at the royal court in St. Petersburg, and sort of military or officers' banquets and so forth. There's a whole discussion about possible precedents in those kind of banquets going back to the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And but at the same time, there's no doubt that there are precedents that go back well before the 18th and 19th century. So there are clear references to medieval banquets in Georgian literature, called nadimi often, that do involve drinking and do involve toasts, but they seem fairly free form. They don't seem to have quite the structure of a Georgian supra as we know it now. There's also the influence of Iranian court feasting, because the Safavid court also had a lot of drinking going on, a lot of banqueting. Then there's the role of vernacular religion, which is something that I'm particularly interested in myself. And finally, there is the source of the word supra, the sofreh, not as a tablecloth, but as an actual type of a ritual banquet. So, so the pre-modern nadimi, according to the documentation we have references to it in medieval Georgian literature, like the Amiran Daudajaniani, and to some extent as well in the Knight and the Tiger Skin, does in fact involve lots of wine and feasting, lots of food, long hours spent at the table. And the Amiran Daudajaniani is sort of a reference, sort of a knightly romance written about the 11th, 12th century, has lots of scenes of banqueting where the banquet will go on for days and days, with the guests taking breaks to change clothes or go hunting. Then they come back to the table for another long, long period of time with more food and more drink. So it's clear that wine drinking has a lot to do with it. That does seem to be the central component. But the toasting tends to be, by and large, limited to initial and closing toasts that involve God and the saints. Often commemoration, sometimes a commemoration of the dead, and then individual toasts, individuals holding up their cup to another person at the table, saying, I will toast to the great hero Sepe Davle, who has conquered all knights who have come to meet him in battle. But now I have come to fight him, and so I will toast him before I beat him in a combat. And then Sepe Davle says, and I will toast the man who challenges me to a combat, and sort of, a bit like that. So it tends to be fairly individualized. No toast to homeland or women or whatever. And then just a brief reference to drinking at the Iranian court. We tend to think of Iranians as having very strict anti-alcohol laws. That didn't seem to apply as recently as the 17th and 18th centuries, where not only did all of their shahs drink quite a bit, but several of them apparently died from alcohol overconsumption. This is actually documented. There are actually several references to alcohol, to people dying of overdrink. And there's actually a description of one such incident by Lamberti, who visited Mingrelia in Western Georgia in the 17th century, who describes a champion drinker named Shedan Chiladze, who was regarded as a great drinker in Mingrelia. Word of his fame reached the Shah, who invited him to the court and gave him prizes for drinking better than his Iranian opponents, until finally the Shah says, now I will drink against you. And the two of them sit down to a banquet table, and Chiladze drinks so much that the Shah finally literally drinks himself to death. And instead of regarding this as a horrible catastrophe, the guests all stand up and applaud, more or less saying, oh, wow, he's so good, our Shah couldn't even keep up with him. And they send him home with gifts. So that gives you an idea also too of the agonistic side of it that I'm going to talk about in a second, but also to the fact that Iran, despite the way, again, we think of it as an Islamic and very rigid Islamic state, seems to have may well have played a role as well in influencing the practices of the Georgian banquet. Vernacular origin. Now, this is, I think, a really fascinating topic. And again, for the ethnographers among you, you may know about some of this yourself. That in Georgian folk religion, and I'm talking about both folk orthodoxy, that is, practices that are based upon roughly the rituals of the Georgian Orthodox Church, and also the quite distinctive, I would say, pagan religious system of Pshavi and Khevsureti, and at least until recently, Tusheti, that these systems both involved animal sacrifice. And so meat was present, but the meat that was served after the animal was sacrificed, the meat was shared out to the people at the banquet, to people who are at the shrine in the form of a type of banquet. And here you see, in fact, meat from a sacrificed lamb that this Khavisberi killed, this is in Pshavi, and made into hinkalis, which are kind of like raviolis that are boiled in water with the meat inside, and that's how it cooks. So whatever the occasion is, there's likely to be meat there, if it's an event presided by men. In Svaneti, when women preside, there's no meat because women don't kill animals, at least not the type that are served at banquets. Then there is alcohol that's always present at one of these rituals. So you have most of the components there. You have alcohol, you've got meat and bread, and then so kind of the basic components are present. Except that the person who presides, that plays the role of similar to that of the tamada in the modern supra, tends to be the ritual specialist who is regarded as the one who presides over the presentation of the offerings. So it could be a chevisperi, that is a kind of priest in a place like Pshavi or Chevsureti. Here in Svaneti, it's a kind of a kind of a carnival festival that takes place in February called Svimnish. It's a bit like Mardi Gras in the West. That is, it's kind of people getting dressed up in costumes and masks, and they put black soot on their faces and all kinds of fancy outfits. And this person here is actually going to be the key figure. He's called Pust Caesar, or Lord Caesar. But in fact, he's going to dress up in a kind of outlandish costume and carry a club and kind of knock people on the head with it when his face all covered up with soot. So he's actually kind of there as more as a comic performer, but he's still the person in charge of the ceremonial banquet, and he's the one who is actually going to draw people together and lead them in a prayer before it starts, despite his rather comic and risque nature. And also at the end, he'll also be the tamada at the banquet that closes the ceremony, by which point people are already fairly drunk, and then they get a lot more alcohol before they finally go home about 3 or 4 in the morning. There also are banquets that are associated with the souls of the dead, commemorations of the deceased at certain times of year. And pretty much any kind of festival will involve both religious performers who preside, but also who play the role of tamada at the banquets that follow the presentation of offerings, and usually in the form of alcohol, bread, and animals at the sacred site. So here are some pictures of these. This one is another Mardi Gras type festival in eastern Georgia, in the village of Matani. That also involves, if you can see, I'm not sure how easy it shows up on your camera. Can you see the gentleman with, look like he has a clown's hat on his head, kind of a cone with a little pom-pom on the top? Can you see that? He's a character that's called Berika in Georgian. He's kind of, again, a clown figure that goes around doing all kinds of farces. But nonetheless, he's also presides over a kind of a table that's been set up. And so when he isn't running around making all kinds of comic stuff, he sits at a table with various groups of people come in and out and who drink with him, and he's the tamada. And if you look at closely again, you'll see a little rope here. This serves the function, it's actually a barricade. If, let's say, this is one of the main streets in the village. If I'm walking along here and I'll see the gentleman there and I say, oh, no way, I don't want to drink with these guys, I've already had enough. But then I get stopped here and I can't go and can't continue my way. And they say, if you want to pass on, you've got to sit at the table with us. Sometimes as well, they'll make them pay a fine of like a ruble or 2 or something like that. But you definitely have to drink before they let you go. And then of course, you walk a little bit further and there's another table with another berika, and another time you have to sit down and drink some more. So yeah, it goes on for a while. This is at a visit I made in 1988 to a church in Upper Svaneti in the village of Ipari. And in addition to getting a chance to look at the church, which is what I wanted, the person who holds onto the keys to the church, a village elder named David Pirveli, made me sit down and with all my guests inside, and we're going to have a banquet. And sure enough, they brought out the strongest Svan vodka. And Svan vodka is pretty strong as it is. This stuff is extra strong. Plus some bread. They just put together kind of a tiny impromptu feast in the church, which might offend some Christians among you, but is actually quite common in Georgia. And that was just part of our meeting together. They had to celebrate it with a supra. This is at a shrine ceremony in Pshavi. This is the sanctuary is in the back here. It's called the Tavarangelosi, or Archangel. It's in the village of Matura in Upper Pshavi. And this is Siko Tadiauri, who is the Chevisperi of that village, one of 2. And unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, which is really wonderful person, an extraordinary Chevisperi. And so my friend Bata and I were there to document a ceremony that takes place in midwinter, the very beginning of March. And of course, it involved animal sacrifice, and of course, it involved drinking and eating. So here we are with him on the one side of the wall that separates the sacred space around the shrine that only he can enter. We're on the outside. We can't cross that wall. Only the Chevisperi has that privilege. So the feast is laid out on this this barrier on this barrier wall, with him on one side and us on the other, handing the drinks to us across the wall so we can partake. And in the final picture, this is from Easter morning at about 3 o'clock or so after we came back from church, and with my friend Bata and his father and son. And so to break the Lenten fast, they have a big banquet with Easter eggs that they're kind of cracking against each other. Whoever's egg cracks the other person's eggs gets to eat both of them. That's kind of the way it works. And again, a banquet with wine and all the rest. So yes, on pretty much any occasion, if it has some kind of religious content, can become a material or a pretext for a supra. And then you have at least in Pshavi, or in Chevsreti rather, and in Svaneti, banquets at which the guests are all dead, quite literally. These are special banquets that take place at particular times of the year. Among the swans, it takes place in mid-January on the 19th, which corresponds to the feast of the Epiphany in the Georgian Orthodox calendar. It's called Lipanali in Svan. Among the Chevsurs, it's called the Sulta Krepa, and it takes place a bit later. It takes place during Lent, around the month of March. And these involve a banquet that's laid out either in the room where the last person in the family died. So among the Chevsurs, they go to the room where the person died and put up a banquet next to the bed where that person was, and they lay out that person's clothes with a picture of them. Among the swans, it begins with a presentation of alcohol and a candle on the grave of the family patriarch who had most recently died, then continues in the house with a series of banquets that begin with a moment where the food is on the table, there are candles on most of the plates, there's a lot to eat, but all the guests stand around and watch. Nobody eats it for a certain period of time because the guests are actually there, the souls of their ancestors who have accompanied the family head. This is Leri Tserediani in this case. He went to the ceremony, to the cemetery, and brought the souls back with him. At least that's what they believe. The souls take their places around the banquet and eat, but they leave lots of leftovers. That's the nice thing about souls. They don't eat much. And then after a certain period of time, we get to sit down. In some Svan households, we actually don't get to sit at that table. There's a separate table with more food, and that's when the living humans get to eat at. Whereas there's the one table is reserved for the souls. So again, these are all variants of the supra, but in I might say a folk religious context, which again supplied models for the standard supra of today. And then finally, just with the Persian sofreh has been studied by the anthropologist Sabine Kalinok, and it's in present-day Iran, it's a women's event celebrated in the home with different kinds of food, usually sweets. No alcohol, but in any case, there's usually a banquet, and the women get together and tell stories and commemorate events of the past and talk about their own misfortunes. Often has a little bit of a sad form, but the idea is you're overcoming the sadness of the past or even the present by gathering together and eating sweet things. And so that, in a sense, it still retains, even the very strict Islamic regime of present-day Iran, it still retains a bit of its ritual meaning and function. Okay, well, we're getting finally to the point where we're going to talk about agonism, and I imagine it's been a bit agonistic for you because we're, close to 1 hour into the presentation. But I do want to finish with this and then give you time to ask questions. So when I use the term, I use it in the kind of the Greek sense of agonistic display, that is a display that involves some type of competition or measuring of one individual against another. But like epidemic rhetoric, it's a competition that isn't intended to win. One crushes the other. It's rather intended to sort of display certain virtues that the other competitor will also appreciate. So this idea there's competition, but it's competition against a kind of shared moral and shared moral background. So in some ways, it's like a sport. Like when two teams meet in some kind of a sporting competition or whatever the sport might be, they don't just pull out guns and shoot the other team. So they say we won because they look at all the other players are dead, so we win. No, they actually have to go and play the game against the same set of rules as the others, and then eventually one team wins or the other. but the idea is that you play against shared ground rules, okay? And so that what I've done with regard not just to the supra, but many aspects of Georgian culture, as I've come to know it over 30 plus years now, is to distinguish two types of agonism, which I call positive and negative agonism. So positive agonism is the kind of competitive display that people often talk about when they talk about the Georgian supra and other aspects of culture. Well, that it's that's very oriented toward quantity, towards the display of enormous amounts of food, enormous amounts of drink, this idea of a kind of a display of excess, well beyond what you need. I mean, why put so much food on the table that you could feed 5 times the number of guests? What's the point of that? And I remember once actually so much food being put on the table that the table cracked in two and the food fell on the floor. And the guests, we were shocked. The guests, we were horrified at what happened. We thought, oh my God, we'll have to go home because there's no way they can have a supper now. Whereas the hosts started laughing and said, look how generous we are. Our food was so much on the table that it broke. And so of course they brought more food out, set up the table, or brought out a different table, and the banquet took place nonetheless. And so, so the positive side of it is, yes, it's this idea of sort of an agonism, a competitive display of, in terms of quantity of strength, quantity of skill, being able to dance and sing and so on and so forth, to talk, to give good, lovely, elaborate toasts and so on. What's less often remarked, but actually quite important, especially in some of the more remote parts of Georgia, is negative agonism. This is an agonism that is related to restraint and self-control. In Georgian, tav, sort of holding oneself back. And so the idea is that this seems to be the exact opposite of the other kind, but in a sense, two of them are kind of always juxtaposed, maybe the one more in the shadow of the other, but nonetheless there if you really pay attention. So so negative agonism has to do with things like self-control, not eating too much, but nonetheless drinking, but you don't show the effects. That is, you maintain your control of yourself despite having consumed 3 or 4 liters of wine. And often eating very little food. There's I think it's among one of the Highland peoples, they have as a kind of a proverb that a good guest will drink all the wine on the table, but will eat nothing, even if wolves of hunger are gnawing at his stomach. And this idea that you don't want to overconsume certain things while you must overconsume other things. And you have to, again, this idea of showing that you're appreciative, but also that you're controlling yourself. And there's a whole kind of culture of negative agonism in the Georgian eastern mountain provinces, Khevsureti especially. And I'll just show you a couple of pictures. This idea of sort of being able to fight other people and actually not kill them, but rather just make a little bit of mark, kind of like in college fencing in the old-fashioned German universities, Mensur, where the idea is that you control your blades, that you win the combat, but you only give a little light wound to your opponent. And then also the practices like, say, putting up with traditional surgery done with these rather rude-looking and horrifying implements. And as I was actually told by a Khevsur, who was quite old at the time, that he had actually witnessed as a child one of the last traditional surgeries that was done by a village dastakari, kind of a village doctor, with no medical training whatsoever. In fact, he was illiterate. But he performed basically a trepanation. We opened up the skull or bored a hole in it of some poor gentleman. And while this was going on, and of course, the person was given nothing whatsoever in the way of anesthetic, the entire village came in, including this boy who was brought in by his mother to watch. And the villagers were not interested in the surgery itself. They wanted to watch how the man reacted, who was being operated on. And he went through this open brain surgery with no anesthetic, without showing any sign of pain or reaction. And the villagers regarded him as a great man because of it, because he showed negative agonism, tav shekaveva, and that was regarded as a victory for him. And then there's a whole story of sorproba, which is fascinating in itself. I won't go into detail about that, but you can ask me about it in the question period if you want. And but all this idea that there's sort of this idea that alongside all of the excess that people associate, especially outsiders of the supra, there also is this other side, this side of self-control that's also there in the shadows, and that's quite important to really understand the phenomenon. So just to give you some ideas of supra excess, and with that, I'll finish my presentation and let you ask questions. I'm just going to show you some of my favorite supra photos. So here we are in Mingrelia, 2005 or 6, I forget which year it was. And we were at a banquet in the town of Chgali near Tsalenjicha. And we have this wonderful master tamada named Chochi, and you can see him there, the gentleman holding up the glasses, who was presiding. And we had gone through, it was already 1 in the morning, we'd gone through a long series of toasts. And at one point, Chochi noticed that, okay, it's time to get to the personal supras. By this time it was quite late and some of the guests had to leave. And he said, okay, so how many of you have to go now? And there were 7 people who said, so he said, okay, give me 7 glasses. And he lined them up like that, filled them all, and said, I'm going to drink to all of you right now. And did that, drinking from each glass, stacking them up as he did, which meant that now at least some of the other guests had to do the same thing. And actually 2 other people, including one rather skinny shepherd who I couldn't not imagine what, I mean, this guy who must have weighed half of what Chochi weighed, did just as well actually in polishing off 7 glasses of wine like that, one right after the other. Then there's the famous drinking horns called khansi in Georgian, which you may have heard about. And this is usually brought out for special toasts on a special theme. And unlike with drinking glasses, with a khansi, you have to empty it because otherwise it'll spill out if you set it down. You can't set the thing down if there's any wine left in it. You have to finish it all off. So it's both a technique for holding it as you drink and also slightly turning the end upward as you go through so that the wine all drains out from the end, from this part down here. He's in the first phase. You can see the end is still down. But as he drinks, as I recall, he brings up his left hand progressively until the point is it's above the level of the orifice that he's drinking from, and then the wine drains out. So he makes sure that he gets it all out. And if you do this well, you can do it without taking a breath. That's also very important. You don't take a breath while drinking from a khansi if you're really good at it. You got to take this all in one continuous slug that goes on sometimes for a better part of a minute and will involve up to 1 liter, depending on how big the khansi is of wine. There are also sort of special thematic toasts in some areas. This is in Svaneti again, in a February festival in honor of a mythical dragon slayer named Kachan. And according to tradition, Kachan himself stipulated how to drink this toast. So he said that in honor of the fact, so he killed a dragon that was oppressing the village. He was wounded in battle and knew he was dying. And the villagers asked, what can we do now that to pay you back for what you did for us? And he said, I only want, he said, well, he specified some hayfield to be given to his descendants. And so there's his name, but he also said, every year at this time, you must drink a toast in my honor. And this is what you must say. And he gives a very specific text, glory to God, honor or commemoration to Kachan, and a blessing upon all those who drink in his name. And so, and it gives it text, Didab Gerbats, Shamdweb, Kachans, and so on it goes, right? And and you have to drink it exactly that way. And you do drink it 2 by 2 this way with your arms into it. It's kind of a Vaktanguri swan style. And if you slip up on the toast, you've got to drink it again. And so as a result, people get, and especially foreigners who don't speak Swan well, often get trapped by this. So it's one good way to learn your Swan under heavy pressure. And I think this time I got away with it. I think I managed only to have to drink one straf, one penalty toast, but I've heard of people having to drink 2 or 3. And here's an interesting case of a drinker demonstrating how you can augment, might say, raise the difficulty factor. It's a bit like in the like when you do Olympic diving. You don't just dive off the diving plank. You try and spin around in the air a few times before you land to increase the difficulty. Well, this guy said, okay, I'm going to not just drink from a horn, I'm going to drink from 2 horns at once. So while drinking from the one, he was refilling it with another horn, measuring the pace that the wine was going in one end, with the paste that was going out into his mouth, so that he could do it without spilling any. I mean, I made an attempt at this. Is really hard. Can I tell you? It takes, you got to, this is tav shekaveba. This is a good example of negative agonism at work, because you have to really control your pace and maintain complete control of the whole process so that to make this work. And another case of which I can only describe as grotesque excess is the idea of people putting wine in all kinds of things. Pretty much anything that can contain alcohol or any kind of liquid can be used in theory and sometimes in practice as a drinking vessel. I did not attend this wedding. I found this photo, somebody sent it to me. So don't, of a wedding in Tbilisi where one of the young women offered her shoes as a drinking vessel, and everything. I think it's the bridesmaid actually. The bride is, so her shoes are passed around, and her girlfriend's got to fill it up with wine and drink from it. Like I said, I wasn't there, so I don't know how it tasted. And then this comes from a Georgian film, a film by Danelia called Passport, where the character at a supra I think he's in Israel actually, a Georgian Jew, takes a glass, flips upside down on his palm of his hand, and then kind of manages to lift up a little bit of the edge in such a way that he can drink it down without letting it all spill out onto his hand or his face. This I've never figured out how to do. I've tried a couple times with water and it doesn't work. If there's anyone among you who's actually done this and gotten away with it, please tell me. I'd love to know. And finally, I'll just end with an example of a kind of a sort of drinking contest that takes place in Georgian vernacular religious context in Pshavi, called sofreh, a commemorative drink in honor of dead heroes of the past. It's always drunk on the occasion of the midsummer shrine festival of Aten Genoba. And so a large bowl is placed on the ground. You see it here. It's filled with wine or beer, depending on what they're drinking that day. Ideally beer, but it can be wine. I think in this case it was beer, but I saw it done with wine at a different shrine, a different sanctuary. And then you must get down on your knees, stick your nose and basically it's almost like you're drinking like a cat or a dog, more or less. You stick your face in there and start slurping it up again without taking a breath. You've got to do it all in one draft, right? And this is very, very difficult to do. But I have seen people get away with it. I saw once this gentleman. This is Yosef Kochlishvili, who was heavy spirit at the time. He's deceased now, and his son-in-law, who was a rather big guy, looks like he can hold his liquor, came up, I think, just after him, and just sat down there and just drank the thing down. I mean, so it can be done. It's about 1.5 liters to 2 liters in total. So it's really a large amount to drink at one time, but it can be done. Like I said, I've seen it. So I think I'll just stop right here. I mean, I can also talk about parodies of the supra, but Paul Manning wrote a great article about that. And you can look at those on your own. So I think I'll just let you ask questions. I think we've already talked or I've talked for quite some time now. So please, I'd like to hear from you.
Oh, thank you so much, Kevin, for this fascinating talk.